On a cold night in 1998, a small and peaceful village in the United States went to sleep just like any other night. Families had dinner together, children finished their homework, and the streets slowly became quiet as people turned off their lights and went to bed. But sometime after midnight, something strange happened, because when the sun rose the next morning, every single person in that village was gone. No bodies, no signs of struggle, just empty houses, lights still on, and dinner left untouched on the tables. Even today, investigators still cannot explain what really happened there, and the deeper people looked into this mystery, the more terrifying the truth became. Somewhere in the vast countryside of the United States, far away from busy cities and crowded highways, there once stood a small village that almost nobody knew about. It wasn't the kind of place you would find on a tourist map. In fact, many people living just a few towns away had never even heard its name. The village was surrounded by thick forests and long, empty roads. If someone wanted to reach it, they had to drive for miles through quiet farmland and winding dirt paths. Only about 120 people lived there. It was a peaceful place where life moved slowly. Everyone knew each other, and strangers were rare. In the mornings, the village slowly woke up with the sound of birds and the distant hum of pickup trucks driving toward the farms. The local diner opened its doors at sunrise every single day. Inside, the smell of fresh coffee filled the air, while a few regular customers sat at the same tables they had been using for years. Farmers talked about the weather, old friends laughed over simple conversations, and the owner already knew what most people would order before they even sat down. Life there followed the same rhythm every day. Children walked together to the small village school, neighbors helped each other repair fences or carry groceries. In the evening, families gathered on their porches while the sun slowly disappeared behind the forest. It was a kind of place where nothing exciting ever happened, and that was exactly how the villagers liked it. But despite its peaceful appearance, there was always something slightly unusual about the area. The forest surrounding the village was incredibly dense. Locals often joke that if you walk too far into those woods, you might never find your way back. For years, travelers passing through the region sometimes reported strange things. Some said they heard unusual noises deep in the forest at night. Others claimed they saw strange lights moving silently across the sky. Most villagers didn't pay much attention to those stories. They believed outsiders were simply imagining things. After all, people had been living there peacefully for decades. Nothing bad had ever happened. Or at least, nothing that anyone talked about. But there was one thing that some of the older residents quietly mentioned from time to time. Long ago, before the village became a peaceful farming community, the land had been used for something else. Something that very few people knew about. Old records suggested that many years earlier, government vehicles had been seen traveling through the area late at night. No one knew exactly why they were there, and whenever someone asked questions, the answers were always vague. Eventually, people stopped talking about it. Life went back to normal. The village remained quiet and peaceful for many years. But sometimes, late at night, when the wind moved through the trees and the forest became completely silent, some villagers felt a strange sense that something was watching from the darkness. Most of them ignored that feeling, because fear has a way of disappearing in the daylight. And besides, nothing had actually happened. Until one night. A night that started just like any other. Families had dinner together, children finished their homework, lights slowly turned off across the village as people went to bed. Everything seemed completely normal. But sometime after midnight, something changed. Something arrived in that quiet village. And by the time the sun rose the next morning, every single person living there had disappeared. No signs of struggle, no bodies, no explanations, just empty houses, silent streets, and a mystery that would confuse investigators for decades. Because whatever happened in that village that night, it wasn't something ordinary. And the truth behind it might be far more terrifying than anyone could ever imagine. A few days before the village disappeared, something strange began happening in the night sky. At first, almost nobody paid attention. One evening, an old farmer named Daniel Carter was driving his pickup truck back home after a long day in the fields. The sun had already disappeared behind the forest, and the road ahead was almost completely dark. As he slowly drove along the quiet dirt road, something unusual caught his attention. Far above the trees, a strange light appeared in the sky. At first, Daniel thought it was just an airplane, but after a few seconds, he realized something was wrong. The light wasn't moving like a plane. It hovered, silently, above the forest, perfectly still. Daniel slowed down his truck and stared at the sky. The light suddenly moved, not in a straight line, but in a slow, smooth curve. Then it stopped again. There was no sound, no engine noise, no flashing airplane lights, just a silent glowing object floating in the dark sky. Daniel watched it for nearly a minute before it slowly disappeared behind the clouds. He shook his head and laughed quietly. Probably just a satellite, he told himself. But the next night, the same thing happened again. This time, Daniel wasn't the only one to notice it. A teenage boy named Tyler was outside riding his bike when he suddenly saw the strange light moving across the sky. At first, he thought it was a drone, but the object was too high and too quiet. He quickly ran inside and told his parents. His father stepped outside and looked up at the sky. The light was still there, slowly moving above the forest, but before they could look any closer, it suddenly vanished. Over the next few nights, more villagers began noticing the lights. Some people saw them late at night, others spotted them just after midnight. They always appeared above the forest, and they always moved silently. Soon, the strange lights became a topic of conversation around the village. Inside the small diner one morning, several farmers were talking about what they had seen. One man claimed the lights were military aircraft. Another joked that it must be aliens. Everyone laughed. But not everyone found it funny. A woman named Martha Jenkins said she had seen something even stranger. She claimed the lights weren't just moving across the sky. Sometimes they stopped directly above the village, as if they were watching. Most people didn't believe her, but a few villagers quietly admitted they had noticed the same thing. Still, life in the village continued as usual. People went to work, children went to school, and the strange lights slowly became just another rumor. But then something happened that made everyone uneasy. One night, the lights appeared again, but this time, they didn't stay in the sky. Several villagers reported one of the lights slowly descend toward the forest. At first, it moved slowly downward. Then, suddenly, it disappeared behind the trees. A few minutes later, the entire forest went completely silent. No wind, no insects, no animals. Just a deep, unnatural silence. The kind of silence that makes people feel uncomfortable for no reason they can explain. Some villagers stood outside their homes that night staring toward the dark forest, waiting, listening, but nothing else happened. Eventually, people went back inside their houses. They locked their doors, turned off their lights, and went to bed. None of them knew that something had just arrived in the forest that night, and whatever it was getting closer to the village, closer than anyone could imagine. The day before the village disappeared began just like any other ordinary day. The sun rose slowly over the endless farmland, casting a warm, golden light across the quiet streets. Birds chirped in the trees, and the cool morning air carried the familiar smell of fresh soil and grass. For the people living in the village, it was simply another peaceful morning. Farmers left their homes early, climbing into their pickup trucks and heading toward the fields. Children walked together to the small village school, laughing and talking about homework and weekend plans. Inside the diner, the morning crowd slowly gathered. The same regular customers sat in their usual seats. Coffee cups clinked softly against the tables as people talked about the weather and the coming harvest season. Nothing felt unusual. Nothing felt strange. If someone had told the villagers that this would be their last normal day they would ever experience, no one would have believed it. Throughout the day, life continued as it always had. The small grocery store welcomed its usual customers, neighbors stopped to talk while picking up their mail, children rode their bikes through the quiet streets, their laughter echoing between the houses. But as evening approached, a strange feeling slowly began to settle over the village. It was subtle at first, almost impossible to explain. Some people later said the air felt heavier than usual. Others remembered that the forest seemed unusually quiet. Even the wind seemed to have disappeared. Around sunset, the sky turned a deep orange shade as the sun slowly disappeared behind the trees. Families began gathering inside their homes for dinner. Inside one house, a mother called her children to the table. In another, an elderly couple quietly watched the evening news on television. At the diner, the last few customers finished their meals before heading home for the night. Everything looked perfectly normal. But far above the village, something strange was happening again. The mysterious lights had returned. Several villagers noticed them hovering silently in the sky. But this time, there were more of them. 3, maybe 4 glowing lights moving slowly above the forest. One man standing outside his house stared at them for many minutes. He couldn't explain why, but something about the figures continued moving down the street. Then suddenly, one of them stopped. It slowly turned its head toward the camera. For a brief moment, the camera captured its face, but the image was blurry, distorted, almost as if the camera couldn't properly focus on it. One officer leaned closer to the screen, trying to pause the frame, but before he could, something even stranger happened. The camera suddenly glitched. The image flickered violently. The screen filled with static for several seconds. When the picture returned, the street was empty again. The villagers were gone. Completely gone. The timestamp now read 3:17 a.m., and for the rest of the night, nothing else appeared on the camera. The investigators stared at the screen in silence. No one spoke for several seconds. Finally, one of the officers said something that everyone else was already thinking. If those weren't the villagers, then who were they? But the video raised an even more terrifying question, because moments after those shadowy figures appeared, the entire population of the village disappeared, and the camera had captured only a small part of whatever happened that night. Somewhere in the darkness, something had come to the village, and whatever it was, it had taken everyone with it. For the next 2 days, investigators searched every possible place around the village. Police officers, search teams, and volunteers combed through the nearby forests and farmland. Helicopters flew over the area, scanning the land from above, but they found nothing. No footprints, no abandoned vehicles, no signs that the villagers had tried to escape. It was as if 120 people had simply vanished into thin air. News of the strange disappearance spread quickly. Television reporters arrived at the scene. News helicopters hovered in the sky. Across the country, people watched the story unfold on their screens. Everyone was asking the same question. Where did the villagers go? But no one had an answer. Then, on the 3rd day of the investigation, something unexpected happened. Early that morning, a search team entered the forest located just a few miles north of the village. The forest was thick and difficult to navigate. Tall trees blocked most of the sunlight, and the ground was covered in fallen leaves and tangled roots. As the search team slowly moved deeper into the woods, one of the officers suddenly stopped. He thought he heard something, a faint sound, almost like someone whispering. The team followed the sound carefully. A few minutes later, they found something, or rather, someone. A man was sitting on the ground near a fallen tree. His clothes were dirty and torn. His face was pale, and his eyes looked completely terrified. For a moment, the officers couldn't believe what they were seeing. It was a survivor, one of the missing villagers. They rushed toward him. "Sir, can you hear me?" one officer asked gently. The man slowly looked up. His hands were shaking. He looked as if he hadn't slept in days. "It's okay," the officer said. "You're safe now." But the man didn't seem to hear him. Instead, he kept staring toward the dark forest behind them, as if he was afraid something might come out of the trees. The officers carefully helped him stand up. They gave him water and wrapped a blanket around his shoulders. But even then, the man barely spoke. He kept mumbling quietly to himself. At first, no one could understand what he was saying. Then, one of the officers leaned closer and finally heard the words clearly. The man whispered the same sentence over and over again. "They came from below." The officers looked at each other confused. "What do you mean?" one of them asked. But the man didn't respond. Instead, his breathing suddenly became faster. His eyes widened with fear, and he pointed toward the ground beneath the forest. "They came from below," he repeated again. Then he covered his face with his hands and began shaking uncontrollably. The officers quickly decided to take him back to the village so doctors could examine him. Within an hour, the man was transported to a nearby hospital. Investigators hoped he would finally explain what had happened that night, but the mystery only became stranger, because according to the village records, the man they had found in the forest had been reported missing 10 years ago, and no one had seen him since, which raised an even more terrifying question. If he disappeared 10 years ago, how had he suddenly appeared in the forest now? And what exactly did he mean when he said, "They came from below"? After the discovery of the lone survivor, the investigation took a completely new direction. The man's words kept repeating in the minds of the investigators. They came from below. At first, no one understood what he meant, but the sentence raised an important question. What exactly was below the village? For the next several hours, investigators began reviewing old maps and historical records of the area. They searched through documents dating back decades. At first, nothing unusual appeared, but then one of the investigators noticed something strange. An old map of the village showed markings that did not exist on modern maps. Lines, long, narrow lines running beneath several streets. The markings looked like tunnels. At first, the investigators thought it might be an old drainage system or abandoned mining shafts, but the more they studied the map, the stranger it seemed. The tunnels appeared to connect multiple parts of the village, almost like an underground network. And strangely, many of those tunnels ran directly beneath the houses where the villagers had disappeared. The discovery immediately caught the attention of the entire investigation team. If there really were tunnels beneath the village, they might explain what the survivor meant. Within hours, search teams began inspecting the area more carefully. Eventually, they found something hidden behind an old storage building near the edge of the village, a metal hatch. It was partially buried under dirt and leaves, almost as if someone had tried to hide it. The hatch looked old, but still strong. One officer slowly pulled it open. The heavy metal door creaked loudly as it lifted. Beneath it, a dark stairway disappeared deep into the ground. Cold air slowly rose from the opening, the kind of cold air that makes the back of your neck feel uneasy. The investigators looked at each other. Then they turned on their flashlights. One by one, they began walking down the narrow stairs. The deeper they went, the colder the air became. After a few steps, they reached the bottom. The flashlight beams revealed a long underground tunnel stretching into the darkness. The walls were made of old concrete. Pipes and cables ran along the ceiling. It looked like the tunnel had been built many years ago, but something about it felt wrong. The air smelled strange, almost metallic. The investigators moved slowly through the tunnel, shining their flashlights ahead. Dust covered the ground, but as they walked further inside, they noticed something disturbing. There were footprints, fresh footprints, dozens, maybe hundreds of them, all moving in the same direction, deeper into the underground tunnel. One of the officers whispered quietly, "These look recent," which meant only one thing. Someone or something had been moving through the tunnels recently. The team followed the footprints for a few minutes. Then suddenly, the tunnel opened into a much larger underground chamber. The investigators stepped inside, and what they saw there made everyone freeze. The room was enormous. Old equipment filled the space, rusty metal tables, broken machines, and strange symbols painted across the walls. It looked like some kind of abandoned underground facility, but the most disturbing discovery was on the floor. In the center of the chamber, dozens of footprints were gathered together, as if many people had been standing there at the same time. And then they suddenly stopped. The footprints simply ended in the middle of the room, as if the people standing there had disappeared right where they stood. One investigator slowly whispered, "Where did they go?" But no one had an answer, because according to the footprints, everyone who entered that room never came back out. And somewhere deep inside those tunnels, something might still be waiting. After discovering the underground tunnels, investigators realized that the mystery of the village was older than they had first believed. The strange chamber beneath the facility clearly wasn't something ordinary. It looked like an abandoned facility. But who built it? And why had it been kept hidden beneath such a quiet and peaceful village? To find answers, investigators began digging through old government records and historical archives. They searched through documents dating back nearly 70 years. At first, the records revealed nothing unusual, but then they found something strange. A set of old documents from the early 1960s. Most of the pages were heavily classified. Large sections of the text had been blacked out, but a few details were still visible. The documents mentioned a project that had once taken place in the area. The name of the project was partially erased, but one line remained readable. It described the location as a remote rural testing site. That meant the village had once been used for some kind of secret operation. The investigators continued searching. Another document mentioned underground construction that had taken place around the same time. According to the file, a series of underground tunnels and chambers had been built beneath the land. Officially, the tunnels were described as part of a geological research facility, but something about the description didn't make sense. Why would a small farming village need such a large underground complex? And why had the entire project been kept secret? As the investigators studied the documents further, they noticed another disturbing detail. The project had been shut down suddenly. There was no explanation, no final report, just a single note stating that the facility had been permanently closed. After that, all records simply stopped. It was as if the project had been erased from history. But the deeper the investigators looked into the case, the more unsettling the information became. An elderly historian from a nearby town was brought in to help review the documents.